On the morning of my 85th birthday, the sun shone through the window, casting long shadows across my living room. I had planned a quiet day, just a small celebration with a few close friends and family members. Nothing too extravagant, just a time to reflect on the years I'd lived, the accomplishments, and the people who mattered most. My mind wasn't so much on the party itself, but more on the small, personal milestones I'd crossed in my long life. I figured I'd make it through the day without too much fuss, content in the little things. But little did I know, that birthday was about to take a turn into something I would never forget. The trouble started when Tommy, my godson, and the closest thing to family I had left, showed up with a smile that seemed a little too eager for my liking. I'd known Tommy since he was just a boy. He was the son of my late best friend, Bill, and I had always taken pride in looking after him, helping him whenever he was in need. Over the years, he'd grown into a sharp young man, ambitious, and, by all appearances, a promising addition to the family business. But there was always something in the back of my mind that made me wary of him, something that never fully sat right with me. When he walked in, holding a large, beautifully decorated cake, I greeted him warmly. "Happy birthday, old man," he said, grinning wide, and I noticed how his eyes lingered on me just a bit longer than usual. Maybe I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this whole scene. "Just for you," he added, almost as an afterthought, "only for the best Godfather." He said it so quickly, almost too quickly, that it caught me off guard. His words had a strange emphasis, a possessiveness in the way he said "best Godfather" that felt unsettling. But I brushed it off. I mean, it was a birthday celebration, right? A bit of theatrics, surely. I smiled and patted him on the back, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. "Well, I appreciate it, Tommy. You know I'm getting a bit old for all this attention, but I'm glad you came by. Let's just make this a quiet one." He nodded enthusiastically, and that smile of his never faltered. He set the cake down on the table in front of me, and as I took a closer look, I noticed the cake was stunningly elaborate. Layers of rich chocolate frosting, delicate decorations, and a small message piped on top. "To my Godfather, the best of the best." It all seemed so sweet, so innocent, and yet, as I stood there staring at the cake, I couldn't shake that nagging feeling in my gut that told me something wasn't right. But who was I to question his generosity? He'd always been polite and respectful, and certainly no one had ever made any overt moves to hurt me before. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I accepted his gift with a gracious smile, thanking him for the effort. But then, something even more curious happened. He insisted that I take the first slice. "You're the guest of honor, after all," he said, his voice a little too smooth. I thought it odd, but again, I dismissed it. I was getting older, maybe just a bit more sensitive to the nuances of people's behavior. As I cut a small piece of the cake and lifted it to my mouth, I noticed Tommy's eyes were fixed on me. His gaze was so intense that I felt a twinge of discomfort. I paused for a brief moment, feeling as if I was being watched under a microscope, but I couldn't put my finger on why. I lifted the fork to my mouth and pretended to take a bite. I didn't actually eat it. No, I was far too experienced to be caught off guard. But I made sure the motion looked convincing enough. Tommy leaned forward ever so slightly, and I saw the briefest flicker of anticipation in his eyes. It was like a moment of triumph, as if he had orchestrated something to happen, and I was about to fulfill his expectation. And then it happened. I faked a moment of surprise, overacting just enough to make it appear as though something had gone horribly wrong. I let the fork drop from my hand, and I slowly slumped back in my chair. My vision blurred, my breathing became shallow, and I allowed myself to collapse. Just a little, but enough to make Tommy think that his plan had worked. The room went silent. Everyone gasped in shock, and I could hear Tommy's voice quiver. "Uncle Robert?" he asked, his voice just barely above a whisper. "Are you okay?" I heard the panic in his tone, and for just a second, I allowed myself to feel a flicker of pity for the poor fool. He thought he had won. He thought he had finally gotten me. But in truth, I wasn't nearly as foolish as he assumed. No, I had already suspected something like this might happen. My instincts had been telling me that Tommy had been acting strangely in recent months, becoming more and more interested in the family business, even to the point of taking risks I had never seen him take before. That cake? It wasn't a symbol of affection. It was a weapon wrapped in frosting. I allowed him to believe he had outsmarted me. As I lay there, half conscious, I heard him scrambling for help, rushing to dial for an ambulance. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. This birthday was not going to be the celebration I had planned. No, this was going to be a turning point. Tommy had made a dangerous miscalculation, one that he would soon regret. In the weeks leading up to my 75th birthday, I began to notice small yet unmistakable signs that Tommy was changing. The boy who had once been a regular visitor at my house, eager to spend time with me, had become distant. At first I thought it was just the usual hustle and bustle of life. After all, he had been busy with his own ambitions, working long hours at the family business. But as time passed, I couldn't ignore the subtle shifts in his behavior. I started to see less and less of him. He'd cancel plans at the last minute, always claiming he had work to do or meetings to attend. I didn't mind it at first. After all, I understood how demanding life could be. But soon it became clear that the cancellations were less about work and more about avoiding me. He would rarely call, and when he did, it was often brief and curt. I couldn't remember the last time we had a long, meaningful conversation. I began to feel as though he was intentionally pulling away, and it gnawed at me, despite my best efforts to brush it off. It wasn't just the missed visits or the lack of phone calls that started raising alarms. There were other things, more subtle signs that didn't quite add up. One day, I found a series of strange messages on my phone. Texts that had come from Tommy, but seemed oddly out of place. His words were distant, almost cold, lacking the warmth they once had. The tone felt as though he were speaking to someone he didn't really care about, someone he had no real emotional connection with. "Hey, Grandpa, can't make it today. Got some stuff to handle. We'll catch up later." That was the first one. Another read, "Need to focus on my career right now. Hope you understand." These weren't messages from a godson who had once been close to me. This was a person who had created emotional distance, intentionally or not. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't the Tommy I had helped raise. Something was wrong, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I knew something had shifted. I decided to dig a little deeper. I started paying attention to the small things. His presence at family gatherings had grown more sporadic. He used to be the one who would show up early to help set up, stay late to clean up, and catch up with the older relatives. Now, he'd arrive late, make a brief appearance, and leave before anyone could truly engage him in conversation. And when he did talk to me, it felt forced, like he was checking something off his to-do list rather than enjoying the time together. As I reflected on these changes, I found myself recalling something else, a strange behavior I hadn't noticed before. He had become more interested in the family business. In the past, he'd always been the type to avoid the details of the day-to-day operations. He'd drop by the office every now and then, but never stayed long enough to understand the financials, the numbers, or the direction of the company. But now he was asking questions, lots of questions. He was suddenly interested in the company's bottom line, in acquisitions and partnerships, in things I never thought he cared about. At first I figured it was a natural part of his growth, that he was finally stepping up to take more responsibility. But as I thought about it more, I realized it was more than that. It was as though he was positioning himself for something bigger, something that didn't include me. Then, one day, it all clicked into place. A conversation with James, my old friend and lawyer, brought everything into focus. He mentioned that Tommy had started to ask him about the legal intricacies of the business, particularly the company's succession plan. James had even laughed about it, thinking Tommy was just curious. But the way he brought it up, that wasn't curiosity. It was calculation. He was getting prepared for something. It was as though he was quietly positioning himself to take control of the family business. And I was starting to see it for what it was, a plan to replace me, to step into my shoes. It wasn't just the cake that tipped me off. It was everything leading up to it. Tommy had been setting the stage for his big move, and I was too caught up in my own life to notice the small betrayals until they were right in front of me. It wasn't just his behavior, but the shift in his mindset that made everything fall into place. Tommy wasn't the young man I'd taken under my wing all those years ago. The godson I'd helped guide and mentor had grown into someone different, someone I didn't fully recognize anymore. I couldn't help but feel a sting of disappointment. I had given him everything: love, guidance, support. And this was how he repaid me? But still, I kept my cool. There was no need to confront him just yet. I would let him think everything was fine, let him believe that his secret ambitions were unnoticed. After all, I knew that when the time came, I would be ready. And I was right. Those signs, subtle as they were, had all been pointing to one thing. Tommy was ready to betray me. He thought I wouldn't see it coming, that I wouldn't notice the small cracks forming in the foundation of our relationship. But I had seen enough to know that this birthday was going to be the turning point, the moment everything would come crashing down. The day of my 75th birthday arrived, and as I sat in my living room, surrounded by family and friends, I couldn't shake the sense of unease that had been building over the past few weeks. Tommy had been acting strangely, as if he were barely holding himself together, and I wasn't entirely sure what his intentions were, but I knew one thing for certain. He was up to something, and today, on my birthday, I had every intention of turning the tables on him. Tommy, true to form, arrived fashionably late. When he walked in, he held a large homemade cake in his hands, its frosting almost too perfect, almost too sweet. It was a gesture I hadn't expected. A cake, after all, is usually a symbol of celebration, but something about the way he presented it made my skin crawl. There was an unnatural brightness in his eyes, and a wide, almost sinister smile stretched across his face as he approached me. "Happy birthday, Godfather," he said, his voice just a bit too loud, a bit too enthusiastic. He placed the cake in front of me, his hands trembling slightly, betraying the nerves he clearly wanted to hide. His words, however, hung in the air like a faint echo. "Only for the best Godfather." At that moment, my heart sank. I had known something was off for weeks, but now I was sure. I knew exactly what was in that cake. He'd laced it with poison, a cruel attempt to finish what he had started in the quiet, calculated way he'd been distancing himself from me. But I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of seeing me fall into his trap. I had worked too hard, lived too long, and been through too much to let a young man like Tommy best me. As the others gathered around the table, eager to watch me cut into the cake, I feigned excitement. I carefully picked up my fork and took a small piece of the cake, holding it up to my mouth. Tommy's eyes were locked on me, his gaze full of anticipation, waiting for the moment when I would collapse, when his plot would unfold. He had no idea I was a few steps ahead of him. I made sure to take a bite slowly, deliberately, giving him enough time to see the cake enter my mouth. Then, just as planned, I exaggerated a faint gasp and clutched my chest as if the poison had immediately taken hold. I collapsed backward in my chair, dramatically falling into the arms of my old friend Sam, who had been sitting beside me. The room fell silent. For a few moments, all I could hear was the gasps and murmurs of the guests as they looked around, unsure of what was happening. Tommy's face twisted with a look of satisfaction, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He leaned in closer, hovering over me, his grin widening, but there was a tinge of concern mixed with it. "Godfather? Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rising in pitch. I managed to force a small smile as I lay there, trying to suppress the chuckle that was threatening to escape. The cake had barely touched my stomach, and the effects were already wearing off. I wasn't feeling any real pain, just the mild discomfort of playing along with his sick little game. I'd given him the moment he had been waiting for, but I wasn't about to give him the final victory. "Don't worry, Tommy," I whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, a hint of sarcasm laced in my voice. "I'm just fine. I guess I wasn't the best godfather after all. Or maybe I was too good at pretending." Tommy's expression faltered for just a second, a crack in his confident facade. He quickly straightened up, trying to maintain his composure. I could see the wheels turning in his head, wondering if he had truly poisoned me, or if this was just part of some sick game I was playing with him. He stepped back, trying to hide the anxiety creeping into his eyes. "I'm sorry, Godfather," he said, though it sounded more like a rehearsed line than genuine concern. "We'll get you help. Just hold on." But the truth was, he wasn't nearly as worried as he should have been. The dramatic collapse was just that, a performance, a ruse. He had hoped for a real collapse, but he'd given me the opportunity to take control, to make him believe he had succeeded. And as I lay there, surrounded by worried faces, I knew one thing for certain. I had him exactly where I wanted him. I was playing him like a fiddle. He thought he had the upper hand, but in reality, it was me who was in control of this moment. I knew that when the time was right, I would show him the consequences of his treachery. The birthday celebration turned into a chaotic scene, with my family scrambling to call emergency services. But I remained calm, feeling the satisfaction of knowing that Tommy was about to make his biggest mistake yet. He believed I was out of the game, but he had no idea that the real battle was only just beginning. As the scene unfolded, I caught a glimpse of Tommy's face again, that same malicious grin, but now mixed with confusion. He still hadn't realized that the game had already changed. The next day I woke up in a sterile, white hospital room with the faint hum of the machines around me. I was hooked up to an IV, and my body felt weak, though the poison had been less severe than Tommy would have hoped. It had only made me faint and feel slightly disoriented for a few hours, but I had played my part so well that even the doctors who came to check on me didn't question the situation. They simply assumed it was a common complication from the poisoning. The thing was, it hadn't really been poisoning. Oh no, I had done that intentionally, made sure to play the part, to fall and collapse in front of everyone just as Tommy had planned, fooling him completely. It had been just enough to make him believe he was the winner. In truth, it was all a ruse. I was fine. But while Tommy thought he had tricked me, the real trick was just beginning. Lying in that bed with the dull glow of the hospital lights overhead, I let myself drift into a state of quiet contemplation. Tommy must have been thrilled by my so-called collapse. The way his face probably lit up when he thought I was on the brink of death. The boy really had no idea what he was walking into. For all the ways he'd plotted against me, he couldn't see what I was doing. But I could see everything. I was playing the long game, and right now, it was time for the next move. The feeling of cool hospital sheets against my skin reminded me that I wasn't going to let this be a victory for Tommy, no matter what. He thought he was clever, but he didn't know that he was already ensnared in my trap. And it was going to be so much sweeter when he realized it. I began typing on my phone, barely moving as I crafted my next move. I could already imagine Tommy, sitting in some bar, maybe at home, thinking he had outsmarted me completely. He probably thought he could coast right into the CEO role and watch the company flourish under his leadership. But he had missed one key detail. The company was drowning in debt. It was in financial ruin, and his name was already on the dotted line. His signature was on every critical document, loan agreements, purchase orders, contracts, and the weight of all of that would soon fall squarely on his shoulders. He had no idea what kind of chaos he was stepping into. As I laid there in the sterile quiet, I reflected on the years of neglect, manipulation, and outright mistakes Tommy had made. I had watched him, knowing this day would come. His arrogance, his entitlement, his delusions of grandeur, I'd seen it all. From the moment he started taking shortcuts in the company, assuming things would just fall into place for him because of who he was, I knew he'd set himself up for disaster. The company was in dire straits, and Tommy was too blinded by ambition to see it. He wasn't ready for the responsibility of running a business, especially one in such disarray. And now, with my careful maneuvering, he would inherit it all. The debts, the bad decisions, and the wreckage that came with it. But I was getting ahead of myself. Right now, I had to focus. I started writing the email, every word meticulously chosen. It needed to be perfect. Tommy needed to believe that he had truly won, that he had achieved the position he'd long coveted. It had to be convincing enough that he would believe it was my last message to him, coming from my supposed deathbed. I had to make him feel like the company was now his to run, that he was the one to turn everything around. It would be a victory that would turn into the worst nightmare of his life. In the email, I congratulated Tommy on his promotion to CEO. I made sure to express how proud I was of him, how he had finally earned his place at the top. But in my quiet way, I made sure to slip in just enough information to unsettle him, though he wouldn't know it at first. I mentioned how everything had fallen into place, but I also alluded to the challenges he would soon face, challenges that had grown far worse than anyone realized. I spoke about the company's growth and how he was now the one responsible for guiding it into the future. But I also alluded to the massive debts the company was swimming in, the unpaid loans, the looming investigations. I even included the $14 million figure, casually, so he wouldn't catch it at first. The trick was to make him feel on top of the world, to send him into the role thinking he was the savior. But all along, I knew what was really happening. His ego would balloon, and he would think this was his moment to shine. Little did he know that the foundation he was standing on was already cracking beneath him. His entire empire, if you could even call it that, was nothing more than a house of cards, just waiting to collapse. And he would be the one who would have to pick up the pieces, all while struggling with the pressure of running a company already on the brink. I smiled as I typed the final sentence. I have faith in you, Tommy. Lead this company with pride. You're ready for this. You always have been. It was the perfect parting message. He would think it was from the heart, from a man who was now nearing the end of his days. But I knew, and he didn't. It was the beginning of his downfall. With a deep breath, I hit send. The email shot off into the ether, heading straight for Tommy. At that very moment, he would be sitting there, reading it, glowing with pride, savoring the thought that he had finally made it to the top. He had no idea how deep the hole he had just stepped into really was. I closed my eyes and rested my head back against the pillow, feeling a wave of satisfaction wash over me. The plan was set in motion. Tommy would think he had won for now, but in truth, he was already sinking deeper and deeper into the quicksand, and all I had to do was wait for the day when the weight of the mess he'd inherited finally crushed him. In the meantime, I would rest and recover. The final payback was coming, and it was going to be worth every minute of the wait. When Tommy received my email, I could almost picture the smug grin spreading across his face. I could almost hear him muttering to himself, "I knew it. I always knew I was the better choice." I bet he felt invincible in that moment, basking in the belief that he was now the CEO of the family company. After all, what could go wrong when you've been handed the crown, right? But what Tommy didn't realize, and what I made sure to keep quiet about, was that his newfound title came with a weight that would eventually suffocate him. The company was a ticking time bomb, and Tommy, ever the naive and overconfident young man, was standing directly on top of it, completely unaware. The financial situation of the company had been deteriorating for years, and I had watched it all unfold. There were hidden debts, underperforming investments, and a long string of failed decisions that no one had ever fully addressed. The truth was, no matter how many assets we had on paper, they were all inflated, propped up by loans and agreements that had been on the verge of collapsing long before Tommy's ascension. But Tommy, just like I'd anticipated, would only see the surface-level glory of his promotion, the title, the office, the corporate power. What he didn't understand was that every decision he would make from this point forward would be scrutinized under a microscope. His name would be on every contract, every loan, every financial document. And when the company began to unravel, as I knew it inevitably would be his hands on the wheel. He would be responsible for it all. And with every step he took, I knew his downfall would come faster than he could imagine. I watched him from afar, knowing full well that this was the beginning of the end for him. I had orchestrated it all so carefully. The debt was hidden from his sight. The true scope of the financial collapse had been kept just out of his reach. But now that he was in charge, he was trapped. Every decision he made would only deepen the hole he had already found himself in. I'd played my part, but Tommy's own ego had done the rest. He was convinced that he was walking into a golden opportunity, that he was about to turn the company around with his supposed brilliance. But all the while, the ship was already sinking. His name was signed on all the dotted lines, and he had no idea how badly things were about to implode. What I didn't tell him in my email, and what I was sure he hadn't thought to check, was the $14 million in debt that the company was holding. And not just any debt, but debt that was tied to loans that couldn't be renegotiated and assets that were rapidly losing value. He didn't know the real numbers. All he knew was what I had told him, and I had carefully crafted my message to ensure he wouldn't ask the hard questions. Tommy had no idea that the company had been using its assets as collateral for questionable deals. No, all he saw was the shiny facade of success, and it was that same naivety that would be his downfall. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as I sat back and let the events unfold. I knew that Tommy, after getting that email, would walk into the office the next day with a sense of superiority, his head held high and his chest puffed out. He would be walking into his new role, thinking he was going to work some kind of miracle. What he didn't know was that everything he touched from now on would make things worse. Every decision he made would come with more consequences. The pressure would mount, and eventually, the whole house of cards would come crashing down. I smiled quietly to myself. I had done my part. Now, it was time to watch him fall into the trap I had set. It wouldn't take long before the cracks began to show, before the walls started closing in around him. The phone calls from angry creditors, the discovery of missing funds, the growing whispers of mismanagement, and all the while, Tommy would still be convinced that he was the hero of this story, that he had beaten me and taken my place. It was almost poetic. The first signs of the collapse didn't take long to appear. Tommy started getting phone calls at all hours, demands from investors, and inquiries from regulatory bodies asking tough questions about his decisions. I could only imagine the mounting stress on him. He probably thought he could handle it. But the weight of his responsibility, the pressure of his role, would begin to take its toll. The funniest part of all this, though, was that he still didn't understand what was happening. He hadn't yet grasped the magnitude of the disaster he had inherited. He was too busy celebrating his success to notice the slow, suffocating rise of his failures. At first, he would try to brush off the difficulties. Maybe he would tell himself that all of these issues were just minor setbacks, that he could handle them with his superior skills and vision. But I knew, and soon he would too, that there was no coming back from this. He was now the face of the company's collapse, and every move he made would only hasten its descent. I let out a deep breath, my mind still sharp, watching it all unfold. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about teaching Tommy a lesson. He had taken everything I had built and tried to destroy it, and now he was the one who would have to face the consequences of his actions. I couldn't have been prouder of the way things were going. The truth was, I was about to enjoy the show, and Tommy, for all his bravado, had no idea what was about to hit him. He had fallen into my trap, and there was no way out now. After Tommy took over the company, things started falling apart quickly. The financial problems that had been hidden from him began to surface, and Tommy's decisions only made things worse. Investors pulled out, creditors started calling, and the pressure mounted. I watched from home, knowing exactly how this would play out. He was out of his depth. As the company spiraled into bankruptcy, federal investigators got involved, and it became clear that Tommy was responsible for the mess. The fraud, the shady deals, all of it pointed back to him. Tommy tried to fight it, hiring lawyers and holding press conferences, but it was no use. The company's value collapsed, and he was charged with fraud and mismanagement. The public humiliation was his ultimate downfall. His future, once so bright, was now destroyed. I never had to say a word to him. Tommy's actions had already sealed his fate. Watching him struggle, knowing it was all part of my plan, brought a quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served, not just for what he did to me, but for the legacy he ruined. It was the perfect payback.